particular discipline that we want to inhabit and enlarge today is European in its history and form. The much broader antecedent of this discipline is not enlightened comparativisms in other parts of the world, but the suppression of already existing cosmopolitanisms. The last wave of conflict with the physical and epistemic geography of the Ottoman Empire is perhaps the most important in our discipline. If we shift into the micrology and variety of cosmopolitanisms, we will have to think of the relationship between the cosmopolitanism of African colonial laborers around campfires, and I'm quoting from a contemporary document which I found in Ghana in W.E.B. Du Bois's personal collection. That's where this is coming from. I quote, "Easy to hear a campfire conversation in the Congo, during which conditions in the Union, as it was, of South Africa, Rhodesia, as it was, Tanganyika, as it was, and Angola are all discussed and commented upon. The cosmopolitanism of African colonial laborers, official Pan-Africanism, and today's African unity framework, and de facto African regionalism or nationalism, combated by endeavors such as, and I quote, the liminal space between artistic creation and literary theorizing that Evan Mwangi locates in the work of Ugandan feminist poet Susan N. Kiguli and her contemporaries. In a little, I will show a little clip of myself discussing the ethical in Bengali with a feminist philosopher in Kolkata. For comparativists with access to Bengali, who may be present in the audience, I mentioned the opening of that speech available on YouTube, where I discuss a poem by Sunil Gangotpadhyay to open up just such a liminal space as is being indicated by Evan Mwangi here. In other writings, Professor Mwangi discusses translations between African languages and from masculism into sexism. Our students might learn to do this for the world instead of choosing monuments to designate a world fit for study for them, cosmopolitanism in the narrow sense. Here is Hossam Abu Elah's description of Ottoman modernity in a text I hope you will all read, Khalid Ziadeh's Neighborhood and Boulevard, and we are fortunate to have Professor Abu Elah here in the audience today. I quote, "The Ottoman legacy persists in the text. It is the Ottoman cafe that takes primacy of place in its chapter organization, and the influence of Ottoman culture inheres in many of the author or narrator's subsequent discussions and memories. If Ottoman rule formally held sway in Lebanon and the surrounding area from around 1512 until 1918, Neighborhood and Boulevard portrays the afterlife of the period's legacy in the city and in the consciousness of the author, who in fact studied at the Sorbonne, and his youthful contemporaries formed long after the end of former Ottoman rule. Positivism, liberalism, a uniquely non-European intellectual Marxism, syndicalism, and humanism fashioned the emerging cultural awareness, notice no gender stuff, fashioned the emerging cultural awareness of the author and his cohorts, whereas the traditional interpretation of the Arab Nahda or awakening credits cultural influence from Europe that came with colonialism for the onset of the Renaissance. Neighborhood hints at a more complicated narrative in which an earlier Ottoman, officially Muslim, benign colonialism laid the foundation for a diversity of movements for which the French could later blithely take credit. Ziadeh reimagines this historical stage as the moment when ideas, communities, and physical settings began to undergo homogenization under the sovereign nations of a liberal, bourgeois, secular, Western-oriented national culture. This reimagining, and this is important, might be productively translated to most of the more populated and culturally prolific Arab-speaking regions, where Ottoman society held sway from the 1500s, Anglo-French influence began to gather momentum in the 1800s, formal European rule took hold around the First World War, and the Sykes-Picot Agreement, until nominal independence began to emerge after the end of the World War II and the Nakba of 1948. I mention this as a New Yorker because every time we step into the airport, this story is played up over our bodies, and you should try to be, as I am, a racially profiled individual. This history has not disappeared. In the event, Ziadi reports that after the French takeover, 103 mosques were built in his city in the place of the pre-existing 3. I want to reinforce this with a brief passage from the memoirs of an upper-middle-class Lebanese woman, my friend Mariam Saeed's mother, mourning that lost world, and I quote, "In March of 1925, she wrote, Father said that it was impossible for the million Arabs living in Palestine to understand why they should leave their home, the country of their ancestors, to strangers who claimed that it had belonged to them 3,000 years before. Their situation was comparable to that of the Turks vis-à-vis the Greeks, she writes, to whom the British had promised compensation if they took Smyrna and Constantinople. How unfortunate, Father said, that we do not have an Ataturk to frighten the West. I'm younger than Mariam's mother, but that whole business, Ataturk and the Khilafat movement, etc., is also my childhood. We are here witnessing the dismantling of a practice of freedom, gender-fixed, class-fixed, perhaps, which is a practical move on the part of the new imperial formation of the 20th century. This has resulted in a deculturalization of Islam until diasporic and/or class-based resistant women are claiming agency within Islam by referencing groups that are not their own, a species of benevolent feudality without feudalism. When Sun Yat-sen claims that Vietnamese women's decision to go through brokered marriages with Taiwanese men and practicing social comparativism, learning language and culture, is an example of third world women's agency, which Western feminism cannot understand. I've actually heard the whole paper, it's exceedingly scary. She says she takes this understanding from Saba Mahmood. Such misreadings tell us that the practice of freedom wants to emerge where it can. The world historical touches the individual, we call it spontaneity. Next, African thoughts. In a report of the Phelps-Stokes Fund based in New York, published in 1924, and you should compare their webpage today, and how changed, how politically correct the discourse has become. 1924. We find these words, I quote, high-sounding literary phrases in whatever language must not be allowed to pass for education. The transfer of traditional methods that are failing in Europe and America cannot be accepted by Africa in its present acute demand for realities of education. A few pages later we read, the thought of freedom seems to have far more charm than that of direction and discipline and law and order. The antagonism, and especially feminists, listen to this, the antagonism to paternalism would almost sweep away the contributions of fatherhood to the development of mankind, justifying white paternalism in Africa. Why do the practical people father-like in African education? Because, according to them, and I quote, the African's present status is a stage in evolution similar to those through which all humanity has been passing. Why do they regularly want to close down, then as now, a literary education exposing the charms of freedom? Because the practice of freedom is not impractical. When we operate as successful organic intellectuals of capitalist globalization, We follow Phelps-Stokes and other foundations, of course, by creating a metonymic world, by choosing isolated monuments and creating a safe world literature for ourselves. I invite you to look at the Nara document of 1994, issued in Japan with UNESCO help, which is actually about authenticating cultural heritage for the whole world, really in terms of, are they asking for money dishonestly? It's this authenticating, evaluating, putting in place a series. I'm not just joking when I say that this has a kind of ideological connection with our world, which is not altogether salutary. As organic intellectuals of digital globalization, we follow an unexamined cyber literacy, digital idealism, remaining on the track of legitimizing the humanities by scientification that has a long tradition in literary criticism. There have been employability justifications from time to time. The Modern Language Association Committee on Pedagogical Publications published a pamphlet called English, the Pre-Professional Major in the 60s. I hope some of you will remember that. On July 1, 2013, Anthony Grafton and James Grossman published The Humanities in Dubious Battle, What a New Harvard Report Doesn't Tell Us in the Chronicle of Higher Education, where they give careful analysis of the way not to read the available statistics and refer to many in the business, law, military, and other professional spheres who have gone forward from humanities majors. They do not, however, ask what these people learned from this early contact with the institutionalized humanities. Alas, case-hardened as I am, I tend to think CEOs, military surgeons, etc., after their nice humanities majors, go on to think of it as a fine cultural background and no more. As I have said many times, many colonials of my generation became Europeanists because we wanted to see how Europe did it. Moving toward maturity, often abroad, we realized that that way of doing also involved undoing other people. The received corporatist fundraising wisdom derides us today, as it did yesterday. I quote the 1924 Phelps-Stokes report again, simply because I hear this all the time, even from my friend, the President of Colombia. I quote, "It has long been the fashion," this is 1924, "to depreciate and to deprecate and often to condemn the influence of settlers, traders, and other people of settler and commercial interests in Africa. The futility and folly of indiscriminate condemnation of these groups in Africa are to be judged on the same basis as the thoughtless criticism of the economic groups in Europe or America." But there is historical wisdom against this, of course. W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, which is not a book people read, they generally read The Souls of Black Folk, it gives a spirited account of the emergence of democracy in the United States after the abolition of slavery, which documents capital's undoing of people. The legitimation of the humanities by scientification is almost coeval with the advent of a scientific socialism, which did assert humanism, but went astray in its model of education. Already in the 70s, Joost Hermant discussed this most cogently. I will not discuss it here, except to say that Saussure and Voloshinov, from two different angles, made deliberate interventions against this impulse. In the United States, I mean, this is just kind of, most of you know this, but it's a potted story that needs to be told. In the United States, Perry and Lord's work on the oral formulaic matched the impulse to scientification. The greatest impulse came, of course, from the Prague School, the Russian formalists. Semiotics swung between quantitative and qualitative work. The world of the humanities in our time found a kind of pseudo-scientification with psychoanalysis, where a sophisticated system of the general equivalent of affective value was ill-contained by the great ethico-poetic impulses of Freud and Lacan. The more pathetic structuralism of archetypal criticism belongs there by way of Jung. A later impulse toward undoing this scientification, located in the France of the 60s, has now lost its impact. But an introduction to the structural study of narrative, 1966, of Colin Barthes, establishing a thoroughly convincing scientific, if not quantifying grid, only to undo it in a swift concluding diagnosis of Oedipus, belongs with the type of the practice of freedom of which I will speak below. It gestures toward the semioclasty of Barthes' last years. Unexamined legitimation by scientificization has now found its niche in neurocriticism and digitalization. Among neurobiologists and genomics experts, there are some who are respectful of the contingent, the incalculable. I often cite the work of John Dupré. I am expecting such an enlightened speech from Jean-Pierre Changeux on the 23rd, and I am sorry indeed that I will not be here, as Anne mentioned, my time in my schools, which is really my second job, is book-ended. Let me go back to unexamined digital idealism. The interest in controlling data will not disappear. As I've argued elsewhere, data today, and not money, as in Marx's day, is the value form. But that control may reflect an ignoring of the nature of intellectual labor in its negotiation with the incalculable. I do not want to appear tediously moral, but comparativism has had some connection with political equity since its beginning. Next section, practice of freedom. It is known that I, unlike Slavoj Žižek, am not a Leninist. But I want to refer here to what Aftekar, and there's a reason why I'm choosing Herbert Aftekar rather than Lenin himself, what he thought was, I quote, an essential thesis of Lenin's materialism and empirio-criticism, the concept of truth as absolute and knowledge as relative. Althusser, as you well know, called Lenin a philosophe sauvage. If indeed Aftekar was right about Lenin's conviction, Kant prefigured it as we must say truth is absolute because knowledge is relative. Kant defined practical reason as bound by this structure, obliged to declare freedom and cause where pure reason would remain inaccessible. This, I think, is why Kant constantly uses the word maxim when he is speaking about the use of freedom or the practice of freedom within the limits of programmed practical reason. Maxims are what Kant calls, quote, subjective. I quote, practical laws, insofar as their subjective grounds of actions, that is, subjective principles, are called maxims. The judgment of morality concerning its purity and consequences takes place in accordance with ideas, but the observance of its laws in accordance with maxims. The hard collective task of the comparativist is to see how this twist, like funky jazz, is to see how this twist, we must say truth is absolute because knowledge is relative, works out by way of different sets of permissible narratives to organic intellectuals of different modes of production in, quote, all the languages of the world. To make a world for our convenience of study is a problem, not a solution, which can itself be studied in vain, I fear, as fieldwork. Kant hints that the best we can do with the possibility that truth may be absolute is to consider it as an effect, mere reason corrected by practical reason with reference to pure reason. I have written a good deal about this and will not dwell on it here. This then is why we need to learn languages in all the languages of the world, this kind of funky statement that because knowledge is relative, we must say truth is absolute. This then is why we need to learn languages, not because it is necessary for coaching indigenous knowledge into the Anthropocene. Trade-related intellectual property or TRIPS don't just relate to pirated music or patents, which are now a huge academic fund source or copyright. Here is education in East Africa again, 1924 running on 2014. My compatriots in the audience will think it's a title. Education in East Africa, 1924, I quote. Not only is it necessary for the investigation of native methods of agriculture and native needs, all capital N, of course, native, to have men trained in agriculture, but it is necessary to have men who know the natives' languages, the natives' methods, and who know the natives' mental background. With this equipment, a thorough, unprejudiced scientific study, say the paternalist foundationers, thorough, unprejudiced scientific study should be made of the agricultural methods practical in each country. Only then can the progress of education of the native to new agricultural methods be safely undertaken. We need to think of something else. Let us therefore consider a mistranslation in Kant now. This is a sentence from Kant. The proverbial saying, fiat justitia pereat munus, that is, in German, writes Kant, let justice reign, even if all the rogues in the world must perish, may sound somewhat inflated, but it is nonetheless true. This is Kant. It is, of course, clear to everyone that there is no rogues in the world in the Latin. It's simply pereat munus, let the world perish. It's a deliberate mistranslation. What we see here is heteronormative judgment, something that arises in the difference between, heteronormative, between an adequate translation and Kant's excess, which reflects a judgment, the rogues, that's a judgment. Heteronormative judgment interrupting the autonormative idea. Ideology as idea, the autonormative, that's the opposite of heteronormative. It's not about having sex, making babies. That's part of the thing, but not everything. So the autonormative idea, the idea as infinitely repeatable as the same, that's the autonormative. Kant's the reflecting a judgment, interrupting the autonormative idea, translation as infinitely repeating the original as the same. This may be an intended or programmed mistake. Perhaps the text mimes this, for Kant, as you know, rarely translates Latin tags in his text, almost never. Such a miming is made possible only through the most intimate act of reading, which is translation as mistranslation. But not the mistranslation celebrated by the powerful in the United States, according to our current dominant theory. This is the moment we seek for our affirmative sabotage, the Lenin-Kant moment. Thus, as a Europeanist, I would say, it is not the willing suspension of disbelief, and there are people in this audience who I think are old-fashioned enough to recognize that phrase. It is not the willing suspension of disbelief, but rather betraying the unwilling suspension of the dull impartiality of adequate translation today spelled by the digital. I'll be happy to discuss at some point the largest sector of the translation industry in the world today, which is do-it-yourself directions. Please let me indulge myself and cite a few sentences from the email I wrote to Naveen Kishore, my publisher in Calcutta, in answer to his request that I send a message questioning the new blank document, on your computer, the icon of dull impartiality. I quote myself. A man, professor of the history of something or the other at NYU, walked into the small room housing W.E.B. Du Bois's private collection in Accra, where I was sitting making notes by hand and enjoying it. Have you thought of a laptop? He asked in tones of amused contempt. When I was in Ghana last year, I had indeed used a laptop. Everything was done by the machine. I just exercised my fingers. Now, in my study at home in New York, unclassified material waits to be coordinated far, far in time from the time of collecting, all contingency lost. This time, everything I did has already gotten used because I was writing with the computer in the head, which did everything. I don't mind if they can indeed upload that into my head. I don't mind using the machine. I'm not a technophobe, but this is a problem. Many European radicals think that this complex, to go back, of the management of the dangerous, incalculable contingent, that is the special task of the humanities, by managing the absolute relative truth-knowledge relationship, is specific to Europe. I'm thinking especially of my friend Todorov. That is the limit of our ignorance. We must learn to know how to look for strategies of this that do not wear European dress, and further, learn to recognize them rather than go farming for world literature. We must learn to rearrange our desire for the safety of the status quo. Comparable strategies. A non-English text. Let me refer for a moment to Rupauri Palace, 1988, by Syed Abdul Malik, a book written about the immigrant Muslims near the eastern border of Assam, just north and east of my home state of West Bengal. It is written in Assamese, a language that I can 70% access, and would never qualify as world literature by the custodians of that certificate. As is well known, the British divided India when they departed in 1947. The immigrants on that Assamese border are now from Bangladesh, but at the time of my father's birth in that precise area, it was part of undivided Bengal. I hasten to add that I am not a revanchist. Abdul Malik offers a section called Excuse, presumably for writing the novel, at the end. And there he writes, referring to the Bangladeshi immigrants, I quote, "To these people who have chosen to forget their land, their mother tongue, and make yours their own." He is writing the novel in the language of Assam, after all, not his originally native Bangladesh. "You deny all rights," writes Abdul Malik, "including the right to vote." I'm quoting from memory because the relevant pages were not in my luggage. I remind the audience that the paperless immigrant is one of the new subalterns in globalization. Whether it is admitted into the Hall of Fame of world literature or not, this text joins a global chorus. Let me delve a little more, and you will have to do without the French translation for a few seconds, okay? I want to enter literary space, make of myself an example. The first slide, please. If we look at the last passage I cited from memory, from Syed Abdul Malik's novel, we will end with a sentence that includes the general pejorative term for a Bangladeshi Muslim immigrant male, Moymonsinghia Mia. There on the screen is a Moymonsinghia Mia, my father's father, Harishchandra Chakravorty. Native of Moymonsinghh, Naib or manager to the Zamindars or landowners of Kauripur, located in Gwalpara in modern Assam. If you take away his upabit or sacred thread, which marks him as a Brahmin, and substitute lungi for dhuti, you will see that his body is inscribed as a Mia, a Muslim man. This was a scandal on my mother's side of the family. In an excuse or koifiyat for a novel, the author annuls the need for literature, for the reality, he suggests, is in the production of poetry. He tells us that he has stopped his narrative in the 60s because he does not want to go into violence and revolutionary talk, and now a novel is unnecessary because his daughter, he writes, produces poetry in Assamese. It is indeed a recognized poet. As reader, I speak now on behalf of that other, suspending myself there, yet remaining my stereotype of myself, acting identity, the paradox of literature, its aporia, if you like, praying to be haunted by that other text, as a theater actor does, the paradox of reading, the secret of democracy, identity as suspension in the other. To tell the story in a novel is now unnecessary. I have been generically described in the text, the Moymonsinghia Mia's daughter, myself, for my father was born there as well. Here I am then, reader in place of writer, for the author has inscribed a desire to remove himself in his excuse. We can go back to the text. English example, regretfully shelved for lack of time. In a text to appear soon, I hope, from Seagull Press, and I'm happy to say that Lara Choksi, my editor, is also in the audience. In a text to appear soon, I hope, from Seagull Press, I discuss Jane Coetzee's attempt at self-removal in search of the effective post-colonial position as inscribing in his novel Summertime. For reasons of time, I cannot include that reading here. Let me then go back to the general argument about the practice of freedom. The word, quote, impractical in my title comes from the way in which an elite university responds to proposals for institution building when the practice of freedom is presented as the chief task of the humanities. Comparative literature, with its burden of entering the lingual memories of other languages, is for me the representative taskmaster. In general, the comparativist or global impulse of these Research One universities is toward Africa, material benevolence toward all except South Africa. Toward India, a mixture of material benevolence and entry into professional expertise, US-led. In Latin America, it seems to draw forth more of a self-critique, and Europe, a transaction between intellectually equal institutions, and I speak from experience. My insistence that an understanding of the practice of freedom applies equally across global contemporaneity with different configurations, because history offers us a relief map, not a level playing field, spells out a different, difficult, but exhilarating project. In parenthesis, while I was worrying about the practice of freedom for cognitively damaged students and teachers on the western edge of Birbhum district, I was told on the cell phone of an invitation from the Italian Cultural Institute in New York, Gianni Vattimo speaking on May 31st at 6:30 p.m. Is there room for honesty in public policy? I realized that he and I, coming to a mature voice in the 80s, were now dinosaurs. Typing my notes in a snug room in Pretoria, I shelved that thought. In Berlin, I wrote, keep it under erasure. I mention these things not simply to show that I've been traveling around, but to show that a comparativism, in fact, I could actually say why I included why I wrote this way. A comparativism is as diversified as it is global. It is not a question of putting texts together in order to create a world. I was in Ghana, where I fleshed out the first part of these notes. I heard there that the Secretary General of the UN had recently said that all country projects should include culture. Culture, for me, is a good way to exclude class. Culturalism, from benign to resistant, must ignore the fact that you cannot learn culture, only languages. I said a bit ago that learning to think of learning as no more than information control may lead to an ignoring of intellectual labor in its negotiation with the incalculable, and that it was not a mistake to mention this, because comparativism has had some connection with political equity since its inception. Here is Gramsci's Notebook 29, where Gramsci changes his earlier opinion on national languages after Sardinian was grammatized. All comparativism is political. Read language literature for Gramsci's word, grammar. I quote, historical grammar cannot but be comparative, an expression that, analyzed thoroughly, indicates the deep-seated awareness that the linguistic fact, like any other historical fact, cannot have strictly defined national boundaries, but that history is always world history, and that particular histories exist only within the frame of world history. One might discuss the best way to present the choice and the tendency in order to get them accepted willingly. That is, one might discuss the most suitable means to obtain the goal. But there can be no doubt that there is a goal to be reached, that adequate and suitable means are needed, in other words, that we are dealing with a political act. Taking my cue about comparativism and politics from this passage, I turn to the fact that democracy is now equated with an operating civil structure, the functioning of a hierarchized bureaucracy, and, quote, clean elections, unquote. We have plenty of examples around the world that unrelenting state violence on the model of revenge and retaliation can coexist with so-called democracy. Revenge is indeed a kind of wild justice that proves that no retribution is just to the outlines of the tribute. It has nothing, absolutely nothing to do with the vision of social justice, which builds itself on its own indefinite continuation through persistent effort. Social justice nests in all children's, and therefore all people's, capacity to use the right to intellectual labor, not just have the right in the books. Cognitively damaged mindsets cannot, in fact, use the right. They can't use books. Social justice rests in all children's, and therefore all people's capacity to use the right to intellectual labor, not just ease and speed of learning. All accountable efforts at social justice are no more and no less than the way in which we can access justice as such. If there is such a thing, if as is clear from Professor Gost's suggestions to me that I should have written, Professor Didier Gost's suggestions to me that I should have written Death of a Discipline in Bengali, as is clear from this remark of his, comparative literature has something still to do with social justice, we have to think of this as the practice of freedom. This creates yet another inconvenience, of course, the obligation to be aware of education from primary to post-tertiary across class. But I never promised you a rose garden. The practice of freedom is not impractical, but it is hard. What would it be for us? To remember that the capital complicity of the global is a lesson in simultaneity. What institutions of tertiary education in varieties of the metropole now have to think about is that globalization has introduced a kind of accessible contemporaneity to us and placed us within it, which has not taken away but rendered obsolete the established ways of knowing the historical. Modernity tradition methodologies, colonial post-colonial methodologies remain appropriate in their own place, but are no longer useful to understand this new situation, which seems to lend itself more easily to a quantified, statisticalized, and, in a less rigorous way, simply arithmeticalized approach. Democracy computed as supervised, safe elections, epistemic claims without reality checks, going hand in hand with a collection of, quote, global curiosities as evidence. Let us rather ask ourselves how we must change. You see, this question is never asked. We are always the unquestioned subjects of investigation. How we must change in response to this challenge to knowing, not how we can add more information and money to the spectacular alternative streams at the edges of disciplines. How can the mainstream of disciplines be rearranged? This is also tremendously hard. Remember, comparative literature has no place in this room. How can the mainstream of disciplines be rearranged so that we and our students learn to think differently rather than separate rigorous history and method from the glamour of easy globality? Such challenges have come in history from time to time, and intellectual historians, as well as students of the history of consciousness, have told us after the fact how these changes happened. This can only be said after the fact. I'm coming from Berlin, where they are claiming epistemic changes. And again, I was obliged to say that epistemic changes are diagnosed later. You can't claim epistemological efforts are different from epistemic changes. But to that extent, we too must give ourselves over to what we call the future anterior, what will have happened in spite of our best efforts. But at the university, we must also make these efforts, once again, to change ourselves rather than simply to acquire more substantive knowledge. Indeed, without the practice of freedom, you cannot use the digital as a student of the literary should. Negotiated independence teaches you justified self-interest. The practice of freedom is the move from freedom from to freedom to, the practical move toward a just world intellectual labor, not just the dictatorship of the proletariat. This is a lesson I most recently relearned from W.E.B. Du Bois, reading his Marginalia and his notes in Ghana. I do not believe there is a direct connection between learning to read literature and social justice. There are many people now who say reading is an ethical act. I don't think so. When writers and critics, indeed artists and philosophers, call for social justice, they act as responsible citizens of the world, themselves perhaps changed by their own practice, sometimes using the weight of their prestige in order to make an appeal. Their real contribution, without guarantee, is that they can be instrumental, we can use them in rearranging desires. Detached from its producers, the literary can become an instrument for viewer, listener, player, teacher to be changed from mere self-interest. You notice that word teacher last on the list. We are not only writers and critics, but also teachers of the humanities. It is our task always to work for the future of humankind, not just pursue careers. The stream of the literary, within which is included literature and music, today the filmic, the hypertextual, must flow forever, we hope, with little guarantee. The practice of philosophizing must be passed on, we hope, from generation to generation, so that the human mind is prepared to use the technological setting to work of science for the betterment of the world. These are very idealistic words which you can dismiss immediately. I must speak this hope, although the best of us seem to be interested in producing good statistics, I scrambling sometimes to be among them. I speak to our students on every level. Postdoctorally, we begin to freeze, some more, some less. To the students, I repeat, when the task of education is understood as information control, the humanities are seen as trivial. Merely descriptive neurocriticism or the digital masquerading as multitude cannot scan the contingent, the unexpected, the incalculable. The digital has all the power and beauty of the wild horse. Without adroit handling, it can be destructive. I cannot follow my own advice in this area. I am not trained. In this sense, I look toward the philosophers of the future. There is a more practical question of what Amelia Sanz calls hypercolonialism in today's digital humanities. To make clear that I, of course, applaud digital resources for retrieving information when appropriate, I ask you to find her online, Sanz, Hypercolonialism. Finally, world literature again. René Vellec tried to combat the competitive European nationalism that had reigned in the wake of the two world wars. It has now been displaced into the so-called European Union, admittedly a collection of creditor and debtor states rather than a union. Post-colonialism, which was already national liberation focused, gave way to a critique of Eurocentrism, which was invariably nationally and bilaterally opposed to the Euro-US. It is within this context that the narrative of world literature has found its ideology. At the onset of globalization, the self-representation of the movement comes in the usual way of ideology from previous discursive fields, from the beginnings of monopoly capitalist colonialism and its selective dissolution of territorial imperialisms. Kant and his idea of a cosmopolitheia, or world governance, Goethe and his idea of Weltliteratur, and, in the second conjuncture, US area studies and the wise counsel of René Triangle in Comparaison et Paraison, 1963, primus inter pares, garnering info from the colonial elite. And, on the other side, and understandably from Eastern Europe and the Balkans, an explicit or implicit plea for European denationalization and linguistic regionalization. One can perhaps place Vellec, Kristeva, Todorov, today Zizek within this. This is an historical advance over Latin, another continuity, also related to de-Ottomanization in another form, even as the Balkans are being claimed by the Osmanli self-representation of the current regime. Alas, opposition through politically impassioned collective slogan culture, as we see today, however victimized by state and police, does not lead to permanent political structures. As Rosa Luxemburg, Du Bois, and Gramsci knew, the trend of nationalist competition the link between the high colonials and the colonial elite, and the plea for European denationalization linked to critique of Eurocentrism continue to come to a head in those children, and now perhaps grandchildren, of first-generation diasporics who make it into the academy. Those of them who venture into comparative literature, translation studies, or any other discipline that still requires languages generally declare their mother tongue as foreign and thus re-establish the Europeanness of our discipline. It is this Europeanness, following the basically good Etiamble line, that made Professor Didier Coste take me to task for not having written Death of a Discipline in Bengali. And I get this so much that you will forgive me if in the very last few minutes of the talk, I will give you a little evidence. 71 years old I am. Take a little evidence that I'm okay in Bengali. Death of a Discipline would have been inappropriate in Bengali. I do read, write, and publish in Bengali. But of course, Professor Coste has no access to that material, through no fault of mine. I write for the Bengali cultural elite, who exist in a different space from the intended readers of Death of a Discipline. In fact, Can the Subaltern Speak is just now being translated into Bengali. And I thought you would like to see how I involved myself in it. The handwritten corrections are mine. I'm going to publish an alternative version as soon as I catch up with my deadlines. The YouTube bit is myself discussing the ethical in Bengali with a feminist philosopher in Kolkata. Go for the slides now, and I'll stop. Okay, this is me, right? Correcting Can the Subaltern Speak handwriting. Okay, so don't have any problems with my adroitness in Bengali, all right? Move on. Will it do? Will it play?
এখানে আমরা শেষ করবো কারণ পরবর্তী সেশন শুরু হবে, কিন্তু যে ভিজিলেন্স, যে সজাগ মানবমুখী মন, তার একটা উদাহরণ আপনারা পেলেন। বাণী দিয়ে প্রশ্ন করছেন, কিছু প্রশ্ন আমরা বাণী দিয়ে প্রশ্ন করবেন বা কেউ যদি করেন, কিন্তু খুব কম সময়, কারণ পরে সেশন শুরু হবে, সমস্ত চেইনটা নষ্ট হয়ে যাচ্ছে, দুঃখের ব্যাপার, কিন্তু কিছু করার নেই।
এই যে স্বাভাবিক বিবেকের কথা বলছেন, এই স্বাভাবিক বিবেকটা যাচ্ছে না, নেই, অ্যাবসেন্ট। তা স্বাভাবিক বিবেক যতদিন না জাগে ততদিন তো আইনের একটা মূল্য আছেই। হ্যাঁ,
Okay, I think you can stop now. I can't be heard. Okay, so you see, I'm giving you evidence. Don't please bother me anymore with my being too westernized to write in Bengali. It's not something you read, so it's all right. On the other hand, my involvement with the Bengali subaltern has lasted nearly 30 years. For them, I do not write. I train teachers. I have not taught at the university level in India, but for short visiting stints, and lectured perhaps 10 times in 52 years. As far as my friendships and my lecturing experience tell me, Jadavpur University has a flourishing comparative literature department which does some Indian language comparativism as well, and E.B. Ramakrishnan has asked for regionalization of literatures in order to establish a robust Indian comparativism. Bengal does not have the same degree of immigrant influx as the US. Death of a Discipline would have been completely unsuitable in Bengali. If one thinks of that round as producing and consuming, quote, world lit, we would produce a continuity subsumed under the US as master of global ceremonies, and, like globalization itself, would establish the same system of exchange all over the world. For some of us, the relief map, not the level playing field. The practice of freedom is required in the valleys as well as the peaks. Of course, Professor Coste is not really interested in the situation in West Bengal. except insofar as the self-styled, quote, native informants, unquote, can feed him tidbits and the inevitable Rabindranath Tagore. He was just doing the usual kind of thing that I'm told is undertaken by writers such as Bayard and Ansel. I have not yet read their work and will find a moment after publishing the alternate Bengali translation of Can the Subaltern Speak. A colleague told me some time ago that I had been invited to keynote a post-colonialism in France conference at Columbia to reference these criticisms by these French colleagues. I'm not, like many of my male allies and friends, I'm not given to, I make many mistakes, I learn from them. I'm not given to self-defense except this final providing of evidence because I'd had enough. A colleague told me some time ago that I had been invited to keynote a post-colonialism in France conference at Columbia to reference these criticisms. I had so not understood that I produced a piece on Patrice Lumumba. To summarize then, I have located a moment of situated, quote, freedom in the space between an original and a translation. Following this lead, I have given you a few examples, once again counseling against the construction of a metonymic world for world literature. Once again, I have spoken of rearranging our own desires as well as our students. I have brought us back to the task of entering lingual memories. I have acknowledged our European discipline and attempted to divert it from global-ocentrism. Nothing seems gendered because everything is gendered. The symbolic moment of gender is the reference to Evan Mwangi's articles. Comparative literature for me is the most global of the humanities and can hold up the side of philosophy that acknowledges the incalculable. We might keep that difficult edge in mind rather than become a displacement of the belletristic into the digital, trying in vain to compete with the unmanned drones and the tremendous circulation of finance capital that continues to dehumanize industrial capitalism, spectralize the rural, keep subalternization concealed behind elaborately showcased social productivity. If you have the International Herald Tribune yesterday's, you'll see an, excuse me for the adjective, idiotic thing on the inside, page 2, talking about what capital can do. Of course, even Marx knew the of capital's social productivity, which is why Communist League called him a capitalist. It's old news. Anyway, dehumanize industrial capitalism, spectralize the rural, keep subalternization concealed behind elaborately showcased social productivity, producing hero worship, but ultimately stabilizing the Anthropocene. Without the practice of freedom, the subject of social media is an interested fool. Work it out, please. There is no bluff here. I'm not a traitor to the discipline. Thank you.
Hello all.